Hi, and welcome to WRHA Ethics Services online tutorial for how to use the Ethics Decision Guide. By the end of this presentation, you will be able to recognize ethical issues. You'll be able to describe some of the major ethical considerations or factors in a decision that you're faced with. You will be able to work with the WRHA's Ethics Decision Guides, and you'll be able to develop a plan for resolving a particular ethical problem. First, you need to find the guide. I'd encourage you to download it, print it. You're welcome to share it and mark it up, whatever works for you. There are various different versions of each of the guides available. They're all on the WRHA Ethics Services webpage. So the address that you see on the screen, you can type in directly. You can find it via the public-facing page, so wrha.mb.ca. If you go to About the Region and then scroll down until you see Ethics Services, if you click on that, it'll take you directly to the page. You can also find it via Insight. So if you go to the main page and click on the E, that'll take you to the list of web pages that start with E. And again, scroll down to till you see the link and click on that. Once you're on the Ethics Services webpage, you'll see the link to Ethics Decision Guides, and that will take you to the page that has all of the various options for decision guides that we'll talk about today. You need to figure out which one is best for the situation that you're in. So you'll pick the Patient Care Ethical Decision Making Guide if your situation is a decision that directly involves a patient or patient care. So this is a clinical ethics tool. The Health Services Ethical Decision Making Guide is for more administrative or non-clinical situations. So if you're looking at something around a policy or resource allocation or something like that, you'll pick the Health Services Ethical Decision Making Guide. They're very subtle differences, but I'll talk about both of them as we go. Ethics, in terms of a definition, is a roadmap for doing the right thing. So this isn't going to necessarily give you an algorithm that will get you to a definitive answer for your situation, but it's a process or a system or a route, a method for getting to the solution to a problem or a decision that is the best for that situation, all things considered, recognizing that nothing is going to be perfect, but making sure that you've thought through all of the important considerations and gotten to a decision that makes the most sense in that situation. Ethics is about right and wrong, so this is about thinking about what's good and what's bad, but it's an approach or it's a system for how we sort out what's right and wrong. This is about the criteria that we use. This is about the options that we have and how we explore those, understand them, discuss them, and consider them. It's important to note that a lot of ethical situations are very emotional, and there are lots of other things that are equally emotional, but that an ethics decision-making guide won't really help with. So this isn't about making judgments. It's not about personality conflicts. It's not about bullying behavior or temper tantrums. It's not even about tragic situations or compliance with policies or standards of practice. When there's a situation that is resulting from any of those things, there are generally other avenues for resolving it that an ethics decision-making guide won't really help with. Even though there might be ethical elements, the main mechanism for resolution is something other than a decision guide. This presentation is about helping people figure out what is the right thing to do in a decision-making situation. This is how to make hard choices. It's not about making judgment, and it's not about punishing people who aren't towing the line or behaving in a way that we think they should be. So it's just important to recognize that not every difficult situation will benefit from an ethics decision-making tool, but this is about those situations where a tool will be helpful. Now, those situations where an ethics decision-making tool will be helpful are choices where there's disagreement about what's important. So the values in a situation are in conflict, and that means the values of the various people that are involved. So maybe it's what's important to the patient, what's important to the staff person, what's important to the organization or the facility. And when those things are incompatible or in conflict, we have an ethical situation. There will always be more than one option, and none none of the options will be perfect. That's why they're difficult. So we're looking for the best option. The challenge is that each of the options that we have will violate some ethical principle or ethical concept. So it feels like a compromise is necessary, and most of the time those compromises don't feel very good. The other important thing to note about an ethical dilemma is that most of the time when you choose one thing, it means another thing is impossible. So you've sort of closed a door. You can't undo the decision once it's been made, and that's when these things are really difficult. So you really want to get it right. You want to feel like you've considered everything, and you've made a really principled decision. And so we'll talk about how to do that, all of those things that need to be considered as we go. Ultimately, you want to be able to sleep at night. You want to have a solution that you can live with. So even if it's not perfect, you know that you've thought about everything you needed to think about, and you've made the best decision possible under the circumstances. A few examples of situations that might benefit from an ethical decision-making framework, things like on the clinical side, discontinuing life support, placing or removing a feeding tube, how to best provide care for someone who is very difficult to care for just in terms of behaviors. How do we support the choices of people whose competence is unclear, or people who are making decisions that don't appear to be in their best interests. On the non-clinical side, things like maintaining confidentiality. So when there's some question about whether to report or when to report something, how do we decide if we're going to do that? How do we manage in a situation where we are short-staffed? How do we allocate our resources, our human, our financial, our time resources fairly and appropriately? When's it okay to cross a boundary? We can do that sometimes therapeutically, but it's pretty easy to venture into inappropriate boundary crossing. So how do we decide what that looks like and when that's appropriate? And how do we support people who have conscientious objections, who truly feel like the care they're being asked to provide or the work they're being asked to do is really in conflict with their own personal values or personal integrity? So how do we manage that? How do we make sure that we respect those individuals and their values, while at the same time making sure that the work gets done? So these are the kinds of situations that a decision-making tool might be helpful with. Now, the first thing that you need to do is find someone to talk about this with. These situations can feel very isolating, and you can feel like you're the only one that's worried about it. But as soon as you have another sort of set of eyes or another perspective on it, it gives you more options. Like you'll have more choices available to you. You'll have to come up with resources or things that you hadn't thought about. So make sure that you don't go it alone. Find somebody to talk about it with. Usually that's a supervisor or a trusted colleague, but it might be somebody else in your circle of need to know or in the circle of care. When you're doing this, review the ethical considerations, and the guide will sort of walk you through what those look like, but also identify your resources. Who else can help you with this? What other information do we need? The ethical considerations that we'll talk about, or that the guide will walk you through, are things like values. So what's important to the individuals in the situation? This is going to be values of the patient or client, values of the staff, values of the organization, so we need to be consistent with that, values of the profession, so your codes of ethics and that kind of thing. So what's important in the situation to the various stakeholders? We'll look at ethical principles, so the idea of respecting autonomy, respecting people's choices, doing good, preventing or avoiding harm, behaving fairly, making equitable decisions, that kind of thing. We also need to think about the rules that we're obligated to follow. So what are the laws that we're bound by? What are our organizational policies? Again, what do our standards of practice or our codes of ethics say about the way we should be handling these situations? We'll look at the consequences. So what could possibly happen in this situation? What's the worst thing that could happen? What's the best thing? How likely is it? What are the short-term and long-term consequences? What are the consequences for the individual in question? And what are the ripple effects? So how will that affect families? How will that affect other staff? How will that affect other people, other clients or patients or residents? We also need to think about virtues, which is a very old-fashioned ethical consideration, but it's the idea of what is consistent with good character, good moral character. What would a good person do in this situation? And we need to think about the relationships, and this one is really important, especially in healthcare. This is how we look at making sure that everybody is treated with dignity, looking at the context or the circumstances that the decision is being made in. Look at the power dynamics and the kinds of situation that people are coming from and making their decisions within, and sorting out how do we best preserve the relationship? How do we best demonstrate caring and empathy so that we can meet people where they are without judgment? We can provide the care that they need, not necessarily the care that we think they need. So how do we build and maintain those relationships, especially in when trust is difficult to get? Some of the tools that might be helpful for making a decision are things like policies. Are there rules in place that might give you some guidance or some parameters around this kind of decision? Do we have a law that we need to follow? That kind of sometimes ends the discussion. Is there a code of ethics that applies? So a professional code of ethics can give you lots of guidance. You can also call your regulatory college and ask for some professional practice advice, and that can give you another perspective. Some areas have ethics committees that can provide a perspective, or clinical ethicists that can come in and help to mediate or facilitate a resolution to a true conflict. Not very many areas have that resource, but if you happen to work in an area that does, that's an option. And then we'll spend the rest of this presentation talking about decision-making tools like the ethics guide. You may have experience with others, and that's fine. What a guide will do for you, or a decision-making tool will do for you, is help you to think through the situation systematically. And that's what we'll spend the rest of the time on here. The Patient Care Ethics Decision-Making Guide can be found on the WRHA website. This is what the Patient Care Guide looks like. So this is again for situations involving direct patient care or specific individual patients or clients or residents. Also, the Health Services Ethics Decision-Making Guide. So this is for more administrative or non-clinical issues. And both of them are available on the Ethics Services website. It'll be most helpful for people who are involved in this discussion to have copies of the guide. So go to the website, choose the version that's most appropriate for your situation, and print as many copies as you need. Then gather a team of people who will have important information, who will be involved in the decision-making process or in the implementation of the decision. Make sure the most relevant people are at the table. You'll need to gather some information. You'll almost always have gaps in your knowledge or your understanding. So make sure if it's a patient care situation, you have the chart, the relevant notes available. If it's a clinical or a non-clinical administrative situation, make sure you have relevant policies and that kind of thing. During the discussion, you need to stay on task, and that it'll be important to keep coming back to the main question that you need to decide. But it's also important to not jump to solutions right away, and that tends to be the gut instinct. You go in with some biases and some assumptions that need to be identified, and often you'll go in with an idea of what you think is the right thing to do. Stay open to other perspectives, other options, and a lot of times you'll find that things that never even occurred to you are viable options for solutions. So don't jump straight to the solutions. Give yourself some time to stay objective and to look at all of the information and all of the considerations fairly. And then ultimately you need to problem solve realistically. This needs to be something that's consistent with policies and laws and realistic resource considerations. And so make sure that your list of options is things that can actually be done and implemented. That'll give you the most satisfactory resolution. Now, before you get too far, before you even dig into the problem, think about, is this even an ethical issue? So if you think back to the slide where we talked about what's not ethics, is this decision-making guide going to be helpful for this kind of situation? Is there a decision to be made? Maybe this is something that needs legal advice or human resources advice. Maybe this is a personality conflict or a moral distress situation where there really isn't much of a decision to make. But if there is a decision, think about what's the evidence? How do you know this is a problem? And is this something that you can spend some time solving? Or is this one of those things that might not be worth solving? The last thing before you get any further is who can help me with this problem. So identify your resources. Who are you going to talk to about it? Who are you going to bring in? How are you going to get information relevant to the situation that will help you make a decision? The first major section of the decision-making guide is about understanding the problem that you're looking at. So think about step number 1, identify the uncertainty. What is it that's troubling you? What is it that's keeping you awake at night? What are you thinking about here? Why are you uncertain? What's the actual problem? The next step is to analyze your biases. So think about what assumptions are you making? What values are you bringing to the discussion? What are the values of the other people that are involved? This is important because it will definitely color the options that you think of as available to you. It'll color the way the discussion goes. So make sure that you've kind of called those out and you're recognizing where you're coming from on this so that you can be open to other possibilities as well. The third step is probably the most difficult, but I'd say it's the most important, is the idea of clarifying the question. What's the actual decision that you need to make? And this is often going to be a should question. Should we do X or Y? So think about what is the actual decision you need to make? What's the question? And make sure you keep coming back to that question throughout the discussion, because it's very easy to get off track. It's very easy to solve a problem that didn't really need to be solved, or a problem that isn't going to address the situation that you're in. So clarify the question is really important. The next piece is to list the major stakeholders. Now that's the people who will be affected by the decision. It's also the people who will be involved in the decision, but those two groups are not necessarily the same thing. You might have people who will be affected by the decision that won't have a say in how it plays out or how it's decided, but it's important to know who will be affected. It's also important to know who needs to be at the table to participate in the decision making, so that's something you need to discuss here, but recognize that even if they're not involved in a situation, there are people who will be affected by it, and we have to think about how the ultimate resolution of the situation will affect the people that are involved. The next section is to describe the ethical considerations. So if this is a clinical issue, so if this is that first patient care ethics guide situation, you'll think about the clinical issues. What are the clinical questions? How does the diagnosis and prognosis fit in here? Things like that. If this is a non-clinical issue or an administrative issue, you'll kind of skip that, and the non-clinical guide will jump straight to the next, which is the context. So what are the circumstances or the context in which this decision is being made? How does the location make a difference between right and wrong? This is where we're going to think about things like what are the circumstances of the person most affected? What is their family situation? What is their housing situation? What are the equity kind of considerations? So things like that. So what are the circumstances or the context in which the decision is being made, and how do those things affect the options that you have available to you? Number 7 is looking at the ethical principles. So this is where we're going to think about how do we best respect people's choices, respect autonomy. How do we do the most good, prevent the most harm, or avoid the most harm? What would be fair and equitable in this situation? So ethical principles is the next piece. At this point, you probably want to think about what your options are. I'd recommend against jumping to this step too early on. So you want to make sure that you keep your mind open to different possibilities of what might work in this situation, but at some point you've got to pick some options and then start comparing them. So probably a short list of 2 or 3 choices will be the most helpful at this point. When we're evaluating those options, we need to think about a few different things. First of all, if this is a non-clinical situation, or even sometimes in a clinical situation, you need to think about the operational implications. So how will this affect our ability to do the work we need to do in this area? Next, you need to think about the risks and consequences. So what's the worst thing that could happen? What's the best thing that could happen? What are the possible outcomes? How likely are those outcomes? Could we live with them if they occurred? And how serious are they? So think about sort of that ripple effect again. Step 10 is another opportunity to think about the rules or obligations that we have. So are there laws? Are there clinical practice guidelines? Are there standards of practice that we need to think about? Are there organizational policies that need to be followed? Because we need to be consistent with those as we're making our decisions. Step 11 is the relationship. So this is again an acknowledgement that all of the decisions that are being made in the context of our relationships with other people and patients' relationships with their families and their care providers. And sometimes we'll make decisions that we might not otherwise make in a purely sort of objective look at things because of the relationships and our desire to keep those relationships open and maintain trust and neutralize power. So think about the role of the relationship and how that connects to the decision and to the options that you feel like you have available to you. At some point, you need to make a choice. So hopefully by this time, when you've had some discussion sort of in all of these different categories, there will be one option that kind of floats to the top. That doesn't always happen, but sometimes it just kind of reveals itself as you work your way around the discussion. But at some point you do have to make a choice. So have a look at what the options are, how they've kind of played out in terms of the various ethical considerations, and then make a choice. Once you've made a choice, have a look in the decision guide about the ethical certainty tests. Now, these are 8 different tests that roughly correspond to the various steps in the decision-making guide, and it's just sort of a different perspective on how comfortable you feel with the decision that you're making. So in this tool, which is entirely unscientific, but just can give you a little bit more perspective, it asks you to rate each of those tests, your decision on each of those tests from a scale of 1 to 5. And then at the end, you add up all of your scores, and the higher the number is, the more confident you feel about the solution. The recommendation is, again, it's not very scientific, it's pretty arbitrary, but if you get a number that doesn't quite fit with what your gut's telling you, it's probably a good idea to go back and have another look at some of the ethical considerations. But this is just one more tool to help you get a slightly different perspective on the options that you've explored. Once the decision is made, you need to make an action plan. You need to implement it. So the person who's most responsible for implementing the decision clearly needs to be on board, or it's not going to work. So you need to make sure that you have that piece in place. But the action plan is important. And then once it's been implemented, it's easy to forget about it and go back to the next crisis. It's important to go back and evaluate. So step 14 is to get you thinking about, how did this work? Did we make the right decision? Did we have the right people at the table? What was the process like? Did we use the decision guide? Was it helpful? So make sure afterwards you do some debriefing, especially if this was a really heavy or emotional situation. And you might need some outside help to come and do that debrief, but make sure that you evaluate both the process and the outcome of the decision, so that you can take any lessons learned for future situations. Step 15 is the idea of distress or residue. So are the people involved okay with the decision? Is there anything that has come out of it that maybe people might need a little bit extra help just getting past or discussing? Think about whether or not maybe EAP or a professional debriefing situation would be helpful. And then finally in step 16, are there implications for policy? Did this come up because we had a policy that doesn't fit anymore, or because we don't have a policy? And if that's the case, maybe advocating for either a review or development of a policy can be helpful to prevent the similar situations from happening in the future. So think about whether or not this is something that we need to look at in a more systematic way, and follow the appropriate procedures for developing a policy or revising a policy if that's where this might have come from. So how do we raise an ethics issue? So where to start? Again, a trusted colleague. Find somebody that you can talk to about this. It's immensely relieving when you find that somebody else is concerned about things the same way you are. Sometimes that's a colleague. Sometimes it's a supervisor. Sometimes it's your professional regulator, your code of ethics, or a professional practice consultant that can help you identify where concerns are or articulate what the concern is. Sometimes you can go to an ethics committee or an ethicist, a consultant that can help you sort things out, or a decision-making guide or a framework like the one that we've been talking about. Whatever resources you use, though, gather them and work with them, and don't try to do it by yourself, because these can feel very isolating and you can feel like you're the only one that's worried about it. And as soon as you have another perspective, it just gives you that many more options to choose from, and it's a relief to know that you're not the only one that's worried about a situation. When you're in doubt, when you don't have resources, or when you feel like you're sort of at the end of your rope, you can always contact us. There again are other resources on the WRHA Ethics Services website. You can email us or you can call us, and we can help connect you with resources. We can help you walk through a decision-making tool. So make sure that you give us a call if you've run into something difficult, and we can support that decision-making process. Thank you very much for watching this video. It would be helpful for us if we could have your feedback or your thoughts and comments on this video. You'll see a link to a feedback survey here on the screen. That link will also be in the video information on YouTube. So please feel free to click on that. It's short, 6 questions. It will take less than 3 minutes, and your feedback is most welcome. Thanks very much.